everybody. Hi. So this is a narrative approach to level design. I just have a quick sound check.
Hey, motherfucker.
All right, good. Now we know our levels. Anyway. So this is a narrative approach to level design. Quick reminder, cell phones off, do your surveys, high five your CAs, etc. Anyway, narrative approach to level design. Has narrative in the title? It's definitely a level design talk, I promise. This is still a design talk, but the reason I'm doing a narrative focused one is because levels and level design are how the players experience and interact with the game world. It's up to the level designer to decide how a story is unfolded to the player. And if you've been to any of the level design talks today, you know that if narrative is a big part of your game, it needs to be a big part of your level design. So I'd introduce myself. I'm Jolie Menzel, and this is the kind of stuff I was concerned with when I joined the industry at Telltale Games, where stories are hand-authored experiences that the player experiences as they move through the Telltale game. So as a level designer, or the Telltale term cinematic artist there, I was really a big part of how those stories were being shown to the player. Right now I work at Ubisoft. This is actually my office in Watch Dogs, but I don't work on Watch Dogs 2. I actually work on the new South Park game, South Park: The Fractured But Whole. And my current, yeah, you have to think about the title. In my current role there, I am a level designer, but I'm also a narrative designer, because our levels and our missions and our combat are so closely linked to the story that it's really a big part of my job to make sure that that story gets across to the player. So similar to my role at Telltale on South Park, our games are coming from the story, they're coming from the scripts, and they're coming from the IP that we're trying to show the player. Everything in The Fractured But Whole needs to feel like a South Park episode, and the player should feel like they're playing through a South Park episode. This is an actual photo of me at work. And what I mean is I'm always looking at the game narrative to understand how our missions and our levels are going to flow. And what the nice thing about that is that even as things change, we have this strong vision of the IP and the story that's been established from the beginning that continues to shape the game. So even as iteration happens and surprise things change during game development, we still have this kind of pillar of the IP and the story to look at. It makes us very nimble, which is important on something like South Park, which is inherently a nimble, reactive IP. So that is a narrative approach to level design. In summary, it's really using the story as the true vision for your gameplay. And that means treating games as a storytelling medium. So gameplay and storytelling are one and the same, meaning your game events are story events, your story beats are gameplay beats. And it means examining the story through themes and expressing them through game design. It's the kind of process we would use at Telltale, taking comic book properties like The Walking Dead and Fables and turning them into The Walking Dead and Wolf Among Us. It's how we took an action game like Borderlands and turned it into an adventure game. And it's how we're taking 20 seasons of content and developing them into an RPG that feels like South Park. In summary, this is really just how do I make this game, level, mission, combat, etc. feel like blah. So obviously it has a lot of application to IP games, but it also has application to someone who's creating a new IP. And where that comes in is when you have an original IP, but you might have a mood board or things that you're inspired by, it helps you analyze those inspirations and capture their essence in your design. So for instance, Uncharted 2 nods a lot to Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark with a lot of its shots and gameplay. It also leans to The Lost World, Jurassic Park, and Mission Impossible, and James Bond: Tomorrow Never Dies. And Road to El Dorado. But it's still its own IP, but you can see when you analyze these things side by side, you see the inspirations. So the beginning of this kind of analyzation is really just asking what makes up your narrative, and that can be summarized pretty easily with the age-old 6 question words: your why, who, where, what, when, and how. So I'm going to break these down into what they mean for the story, and then we're going to break them down into what they mean for gameplay. So from a story perspective, our why here represents our theme, and this is the purpose of the thing that you're making. It's the message you're trying to get to the viewer, player, experiencer, whatever they're calling VR now, etc. Your who is your characters, and often your characters are going to embody some part of your theme. They're the vessels by which you're telling this story. There's the setting, so when and where it's happening. The what, which is your plot and events. So this is when we start getting down into the beat-by-beat progression of the actual story you're telling. When is the time of events relative to each other? So it's how those things from our plot and events are structured and paced next to each other. And then how is our presentation? So how are you telling the story? How are you showing these characters, these settings, these plots, these time of events to support your theme? So it kind of is, it's not really a linear list, it's really a cyclical list, always going back to that theme and that feeling. That might be really confusing. So I'm going to go into a example using a movie you might have guessed that I like a lot. It's Die Hard. So let's analyze Die Hard. Let's pretend we're gonna make a game, a Die Hard game. Because who doesn't want to make a Die Hard game? So we have our 6 questions. We have our themes. Above all, Die Hard's about masculinity. It's an 80s movie, of course. And that's expressed by the following your gut instincts of McClane, and also love. He's very motivated by the love of his wife. And then there's some minor themes like greed and duty and humility. We have characters, McClane, Hans Gruber the villain, Holly McClane's wife. Those guys embody the themes that we just went over. Then we dig into our where. It's the 80s. It's Los Angeles, specifically this fictional building, Nakatomi Plaza, which has unfinished floors, these elevator shafts. It's not done being built, and so there's still these opulent boardrooms. There's a roof and a helipad. And the important thing about our where here is the details, of course, but also the feelings that those spaces create. So there's a lot of verticality. It creates feelings of vertigo, of claustrophobia. They make McClane feel very isolated while he's running from the terrorists. It's also Christmas. Yay. Which is actually important to the theme. Like, the theme is about love and family, and Christmas plays a part in that. So our what is, this is where we actually start digging into the plot, the events of the movie. So after coming to LA to patch things up with his wife, McClane attempts to save her and her coworkers at the Nakatomi Plaza that were taken hostage by a group of German terrorists. That's what happens in the game, or in the movie rather. And then we're going to talk, and then we get into this when, and remember, when is how that plot I just described is actually told. So analyzing that it's a linear storyline, so those events happen in chronological order. This isn't Memento, it's not going backwards, it's linear in chronological order. There's also parallel storytelling, and what I mean by that is we're cutting between those characters. We're looking at a little bit of what McClane's doing versus what a little bit of the terrorists are doing. And then those moments, there's these slow, suspenseful moments, and they quickly ramp into and back out of action. So you can see kind of this cadence of those events that happen in those linear and parallel storylines. And then the how, which is a big one. Lots of suspense. It's a thriller. Lots of action scenes when they do ramp into them. And then it's kind of subset by these irreverent moments of humor from McClane. So he has his one-liners, he makes little jokes, he kind of questions the whole conceit of the thing as he's moving through this crazy building. And then the other thing is it's an omnipotent point of view. So what that means is we as the viewer know what every character is doing, even if McClane and Hans, the villain, do not know what each other is doing. The drama is coming from us watching those two characters discover what's happening. So we defined all that about Die Hard. And so we have our 6 question words, and we have the 6 story things that those complement. So what I do from here is that I separate our top 3 into story constants. So these are things that are just a part of your story inherently. And then the bottom 3 are what I call the game variables. So as we start digging into how to make this a game, we kind of already have these top 3 things defined. When you have something like Walking Dead or Wolf Among Us, where you're adding in characters to existing IP, you're using the IP's theme to build those characters and build those settings if they are new to the IP, but it's pretty well defined by the IP or the story already. Where things get interesting, and we're going to start making these into game things, is the bottom three. So we're going to turn plot and events into mechanics. So the things that are happening are the things that are happening. They're the mechanics that you're using. Timed events becomes pacing, and presentation becomes tone. And tone's pretty big, but we'll get to that later. But first, mechanics. So mechanics are the methods by which the player interacts with the game. So that's the gameplay definition. From a story perspective, it's the methods by which the player experiences the story. Now, mechanics are largely going to be defined by your genre. And what I have here are 3 different Fallout games. They're part of the Fallout AP, but they all have different mechanics. And each of those different genres of Fallout game support the themes of Fallout in a different way. So while you have simulation mechanics in Fallout Shelter, such as like building, managing people, versus the open world mechanics, your action, your shooting, your cover, they're all informed by this IP. Where things get interesting is pacing. So pacing, or time and events of our story, the rhythm and tempo of our gameplay. It's the rate of activity or movement and the flow of your gameplay. From a story perspective, it's the exact same thing. It's the flow of the story. So it's all about flow, rhythm, tempo. And so we have our mechanics defined probably by our game already. Now we want to control the pace of those events and how those mechanics are used. And pace in video games is really just how hard is the player being pushed to move forward versus asked to stay put. So movement incentives versus movement deterrents. Movement incentives, pretty obvious. Like if you put a threat behind somebody, they're going to go the other direction. Man, I'm glad you guys know this movie still. I don't feel old. Objectives. If you played Mario Sunshine, you learn very early on, you pretty much always want to clear out goo. And so even when the objective of the level isn't completely obvious, there's moment-to-moment breadcrumbing of the objective of, I need to clean this place. If you haven't played Mario Sunshine, it's the same concept as the original Super Mario games where there's coins. You want to collect coins. You haven't played Super Mario, I don't know what to tell you. And then a couple other incentives, movement, meaning movement around the player. So other NPCs walking by them. A big trick games like to play is an NPC will take your objective. So combo those things, and that NPC will run away. So double incentive. And then time limits, which have kind of fallen out of vogue, but you can look to a lot of older games like Sonic 2. There's a time limit to how long you can be underwater. So you get out of being underwater as fast as you can. It's a very big incentive to keep going upwards. And then we have our deterrents. So the first deterrent here is tension, and that's a perceived threat. It's the difference between seeing a guy over there and wanting to hide from him and think about how you're going to deal with him versus just getting bombarded by bad dudes. So it's that perceived threat that's going to slow a player down. Then we have obstacles, obviously put something in their way, going to slow them down, pretty easy. And then we have change in gameplay and movement. The examples I have here are puzzles and dialogue choices. And we'll dig into that in a moment, how changing the kind of mode of gameplay your player's in is going to slow them down. But first I want to talk about pacing and storytelling methods. So there's a lot of ways to tell a story in a game, and those techniques also have an effect on the pace. So I'm going to analyze a few storytelling methods in games. And we're going to evaluate them on 2 axes. They're allowing for gameplay and how they tell the story. Put another way, it's their player agency that they afford and the certainty of delivery, meaning how certain am I that plot point is going to be expressed because I'm telling the story in this way. So to get some examples on the board, cutscenes are a high certainty, low agency way to tell a story because you're making the player look at it and watch it, versus the inverse, which is environmental storytelling, low certainty but high agency. The player chooses to engage or not in your particular story beat. And then we have triggered dialogue and narrative systems. But first, they're better described visually. So here we have a graph explaining player agency and certainty of delivery. So environmental storytelling is up on the high agency, low certainty spectrum, and cutscenes are kind of complementing that on the other end. So low agency, high certainty. And then we have some techniques by which triggered dialogue is often shown. So on our high agency spectrum, it's things like shouts, things like barks, stuff the player might miss, but is present in the world and tells a story. In the middle here, we have audio logs and narration, which are great because the player can move around, but they may or may not be listening to them, and it's hard to kind of account if they have or not. Walk and talks kind of round out. And then we have over by cutscenes, just a little bit more player agency than cutscenes, or QTEs, because they're interactive cutscenes, let's be honest. And so what we're finding here is this kind of curve, and this curve represents how much the player is in control of the narrative exposition of the story. The inverse of this being, of course, how much control you as a designer have. And these aren't really here to judge these on better or worse. What this is here to help you judge is what's more appropriate for your story and what's going to apply to your pace better to get your story and your feelings across. So up kind of above our curve, which seems very enticing, is dialogue and gameplay choices. But the caveat with those, even though they have this great high agency, high delivery, you're asking the player to change how they're playing your game very specifically to a different mode of gameplay. It might not fit in your genre, it might not fit in your IP or your story at all, but it can be useful if you want to support that kind of thing in your game. We had to be very careful with them at Telltale because they do change how the players flow. So we might have a flow state where a player is kind of just, this is an example from episode 3, where the player is trying to solve a mystery of who's stealing food. And you're walking around and you're picking up clues, and then suddenly you tell Kenny you killed somebody. And it can be very jarring, and like changing that kind of gameplay can kind of pull them out of that flow of solving the mystery and detract them. It was fine in this situation because inherently this part of the gameplay was in the beginning of the game. It was very slow. But something like this isn't appropriate when we want to have the player go into an action moment. So, when Lee's exploring the kitchen where Clementine lives, we're going to use something like a QTE to keep the flow of the pace going, and often we'll try to complement the camera angles to keep our pace, keep that mode of gameplay from changing too much. So even if the way the player is controlling the game is changing, there's a flow that's maintained because the cameras make sense and they flow like a movie. And that way we can still have moments of character development, but they're kind of sandwiched between these moments of gameplay. Now I'm going to dig into tone. So tone is how you're presenting your theme. It's the style or the manner of expression your piece of work has. It's how you're approaching the theme, and it's how you're attaining the feeling that you want to find in your players. So how to set the tone? There's many ways to set the tone. Cameras and your viewpoint, your lighting, your color palette, how your characters are written. Not only the characters, but also your menus and your UI, anything that's telling the player something. And then also your characters' performances, acting and VO, so how the characters are moving, how the characters are delivering their voice. And of course, music and sound effects. So these are the kind of things that really need to be aligned with your original IP if you are using an IP, or at least need to be analyzed if you're using a mood board or a collection of inspirations. Something we did actually on, especially Wolf Among Us, is Wolf Among Us is based on Fables, which is a Vertigo comic. And we didn't have any cinematic reference from a TV show, but we had the comic, and we actually analyzed the comic from a camera viewpoint. So even if you're not working from a movie or a television show, you can still find those visual inspirations. With Walking Dead, we even went outside Walking Dead itself because we were very inherently working off of the comic universe. So we found other horror movies, other ways that horror was portrayed, and character moments were portrayed within horror to get that done. So again, tone is really the presentation of your theme. I have 3 games up here. The first one's Mafia 3, Grand Theft Auto 5, and Saints Row. What they all have in common is they're open world, they're action-adventure games. They all start with a bank robbery, weirdly. I guess that was a thing. But like the way this bank robbery is portrayed is they're all very different. Mafia is a very serious game. It's about, racial tension in the 1960s in the American South, pretty serious. So the palettes are very, there's a lot of contrast. They often use kind of one color overlaid on the rest of the game to get an emotion out of that color and go from there. GTA, even though this is a very tense scene and it's kind of the one where everything like really goes to shit for the characters, you still see high saturation and lots of colors. GTA is ready to be a cinematic game from the get-go, even when it has to be a little more muted than normal. You'll see a lot of bright colors while you're driving around any GTA game. And then Saints Row, I could not pinpoint the theme of Saints Row, to be honest. I think if you ask why to a Saints Row game, you get the answer, why not? And you can see that in how they portray the game. There's bright colors, it's pinks, it's cyans, it goes ball to the wall, it does not care, and that's great. Like that, it knows what it is, and that's the theme and the feeling that they are trying to find. So, getting back to Die Hard, why we're all here. So Die Hard has a game, which I don't know if you guys have played. It's on the PS1. It's the Die Hard trilogy. I just want to show you part 1 of Die Hard, which is, I guess, based on the first Die Hard movie. This is a really fun game, by the way. Out of context, not knowing it's a Die Hard game, it is kind of about police brutality. It's a really good soundtrack, too.
Don't let him get away. Die, cowboy.
That's better. Betrayal.
So, I can't underscore enough how fun this game is, but let's look at it critically for a second, the story that we learned about Die Hard for this game. We had masculinity through violence, primarily. Pretty much only McClane on the characters. We didn't really see anybody else there. We're in Nakatomi Plaza, I think. I'm killing bad guys. If someone asked me the story of that game, I'd say I shot a lot of guys. And they said some funny one-liners that were from the movie. And that happened in a very linear, singular, constant flow. It was told through third-person wide shots. There was lots of quippy, constant action, fast-paced music that kicks ass. That music's really good. Let's get real. So it's not much as Die Hard as it is kind of a product of its time in video games, which was Doom, Quake. I have Resident Evil down here even. That's more the feeling of this game, because it's very much influenced by the games of its time, not Die Hard, the movie. Do you guys want to watch Die Hard? Okay, we've all seen Die Hard. We won't watch the whole movie. I definitely watched this movie twice while making this GDC presentation. So we didn't get to, I just realized that's a longer clip than I wanted to show, but the point of it is that McClane's not running around shooting people. He uses his gun as a puzzle tool, honestly. He uses it to open a door. Later on in that scene, he actually is going to put that gun in the fan to stop it. He then puts the gun into a vent or into an elevator shaft, ties a rope to it, and rappels down the elevator shaft using that. He doesn't use it as a weapon. It's a puzzle inventory tool. He's Sam and Max, basically. So again, it's really, and again, he was running from those guys. He wasn't getting he wasn't shooting someone like a Doom. It's really less like Doom and more like something like Inside, actually, where you should feel like you're being chased and feel like you're running away from something that's more powerful than you. He's a New York Police Department cop. He's not a German terrorist who's trained to do this as a job. So really quickly, I just want to wrap up. Die Hard, this elevator shaft scene, or lead into the elevator shaft scene. It has that masculinity theme of following your gut and love, because he's really doing this for his wife, I guess. It's really focused on McClane, but also Carl. Like, we see a lot of shots of Carl, who has this vendetta against McClane for killing his brother, if you're familiar with the film. So it's really not just about our hero here, it's about the enemy as well. Where it's Nakatomi Plaza, but specifically those shafts and vents before that we talked about that cause those feelings of anxiety and isolation. It has, so what happens in these scenes, he's mostly escaping and outwitting the terrorists. So he's keeping one step ahead of them by using his gun as an adventure game puzzle tool. It's linear, it's that fast action mixed with the slower, tense moments. Die Hard has a lot of slow moments. In fact, a gun doesn't get fired until 18 minutes in. It takes a lot of time to set itself up, but that's what makes those action scenes feel so good when you do get to them. And then the how, I can dig into this forever, but on a high level, the suspense and danger is shown with tight cameras, tense music. We still get those personal moments with McClane, lots of shots of his eyes bugging out and freaking out about something, and moments of levity. We didn't get to the part where he's putting the gun in the elevator shaft, but he just kind of has a lot of like, shit, John, what are you doing? And he kind of does that the whole movie. But that's important to like how that feels and how it kind of offsets that suspense and danger. So again, we have our lovely themes, or our lovely story contents that we're going to put in this little blue box. And then our red themes we're going to put in this red box. And then let's make a Die Hard game. So I'm going to assume this is an action game. As much as I want to make an adventure game for Die Hard, I don't know how many producers would say yes to that. So let's assume we're making an action game. We're going to use mechanics from that. So our verbs were escape and outwit the terrorists. So we look at escape, and we find running, we find looking for cover, the act of looking for the cover, and outwit, so stealth, using that cover, being strategic about when you go out and attack somebody, and doing puzzles. From pacing, fast action, slow tense moments. So our fast moments, we're probably gonna get the story through with QTEs, cutscenes, things that we can get by quickly. Even if the player might lose control for a second, we're getting the story moments in we need as fast as we can. And then in slow tense moments, we're giving the player that air to breathe so they can look at the environment, they can hear shouts, they can kind of take in things at their own pace. And then presentation, again, your story and like your source material and your gameplay should be pretty united here. So tight cameras, tense music, personal moments of levity. Integrating these things into your game however you can is going to be critical to making it feel like the source material, like the target thing you're trying to make. In a nutshell, that's a narrative approach to level design.